Good evening and welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. It's your host and fellow true crime insomniac, Nancy Miller here. If you are new to the podcast, well, Dead Sleep is a true crime show made for nighttime listening, which means no 911 calls, no gory details, no loud, obnoxious ads. And it's worth noting, no AI. I make this show mostly by myself, and I really enjoy it. But it does take a little extra time to make these longer episodes, so thank you for your patience. This month, we will have a total of 3 episodes, 2 free ones and 1 June bonus. If you would like to enjoy that June bonus, you can subscribe via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. As always, your support truly keeps this show going. Thank you so much. Now, as we unwind, allow me to share a bit about tonight's episode, one that takes place in the South, South Carolina. So it might be helpful to learn a unique Southern phrase. And that phrase is, bless her heart. Now, if you're not from the South, you might think bless her heart is an expression of gratitude or a compliment. After all, it has the words bless and heart in it. It has to be nice, right? So it can come as a surprise for those of us not from the South that bless her heart is actually a bit of sugar-coated sarcasm, an expression that conveys a mixture of pity and contempt, a way to note that someone had the best intentions, even if the end result was an utter disaster. She tried. Oh, bless her heart. And if there were a Bless Her Heart award, the award this year would go to a certain South Carolina County Court clerk named Becky Hill. By now, we all know about Miss Becky, who helped manage the trial of Alex Murdaugh in South Carolina back in 2023, and her actions have resulted in those convictions being overturned, and Alex Murdaugh getting a retrial. That trial is expected to happen sometime in 2027. But for now, it's left many people wondering, what exactly did Becky do? How did a clerk of the court become so involved in a double murder case that she was accused of jury tampering? Along with other charges, she actually pled guilty to in December of 2025, which we will get to later in the episode. But the bottom line is, thanks to Becky Hill, lightning will strike twice. The so-called trial of the century will now have a sequel. Not only will Alex Murdaugh be getting a retrial, he's also suing Becky Hill for his legal fees from that first trial, in amount upwards of $600,000. His attorneys have accused Becky Hill of violating their client's Sixth Amendment right, the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. A jury, they say, was compromised by Becky Hill's actions, her comments, and her strategic efforts to ensure Alex Murdaugh was found guilty in the murders of his wife and son. Of course, Alex Murdaugh isn't going to walk free. He remains in prison on the plea deal that he arranged after those convictions. 27 years for the rampant fraud and financial crimes he confessed to. But 27 years, that's not 2 consecutive life sentences. Which means, if his lawyers have their way, Alex Murdaugh could be acquitted. And around 2050, hobble out of prison in his early 80s. He will admit to lying, cheating, stealing, drug addiction, embezzlement, carelessness, a reckless apathy that destroyed many people's lives. But Alex maintains he is not a family annihilator. He would never hurt his family. Maybe other people's families. Maybe people who saw him as family. But not his own blood. He never hurt them. He swore it. Now, if you're listening to this show, it's fair to assume a certain amount of Murdaugh family fluency. But if you'd like to know more about the original case, including the reason why I'm calling him Alex and not Alec, you can listen to an episode I released in January. It's called The Devil She Knew. It's available for free, and you can find it in the main feed. And interestingly, at the time, in December, I did a ton of research on Becky Hill for that episode that I didn't end up using. And now I have an opportunity to revisit some of that material. So what exactly went wrong? And what did Becky Hill have to do with it? Well, there's her version of events, which she wrote about in a self-published memoir. It's titled Behind the Doors of Justice, The Murdaugh Murders. And it was published just 4 months after the conclusion of the trial. And then scandalously pulled from the internet shelves for reasons we will get to later in the episode. So I have not read Becky Hill's own book because the only existing copies out there are now hundreds of dollars. There's even a hardcover option that's over $2,000. So this episode is drawn from media coverage around the book, along with material from local newspapers about the trial, and the best book, I think, on the whole Alex Murdaugh case. It's by Valerie Berlin. It's called The Devil at His Elbow. This is, of course, my interpretation of events, all factual, just retold with a dead sleep spin on things. Lots of segues and sidebars to fatigue our overactive minds. And to tell the story of Becky Hill and who she was and how she got herself in so much trouble. We won't start with those brutal murders in 2021, or the bitter courtroom battle in 2023, or the accusations of jury tampering in 2026. To understand Becky Hill, we must travel far back in time, back to the spring of 1985, when teenage Miss Becky was in the first fight of her life. The cutthroat competition of which girl would be the next Miss Walterboro. Walterboro was a small town, but if you think this wasn't a battle to the death, then you don't know beauty pageants in South Carolina in the 1980s. Because they were not about beauty exactly. They were about opportunity. A win in a local pageant like this could be just the thing to open the door for a young woman, including her education and her choice of a husband. Miss Becky wasn't the prettiest or the flashiest. Her greatest talent was exuding virtue. While the other girls wore strapless, shiny organza dresses with heavy makeup that was like something out of Dynasty, Becky Hill was more Little House on the Prairie. She wore a very modest, high-necked white gown with just a bit of lip gloss, her brown hair falling naturally around her shoulders. But it was her stage performance in the talent competition that really clinched it for Miss Becky. Everybody in Walterboro knew the girl with the best voice was Varsha Williams. And Varsha's rendition of Baby Come to Me, well, it sounded just like Patty Austin in the original 1981 recording. But Becky, as always, she took things a little further. doing just a bit more than everybody else. The song Becky chose to sing that night was a heart-wrenching ballad, a 1978 golden oldie by Anne Murray called You Needed Me. Oh, but that night, Becky did more than just sing the song. She visually performed it, translating all of the lyrics into American Sign Language, gesturing every word with her hands. She likely signed it in the present tense because establishing past tense in ASL, well, it's a little complicated while performing the lyrics to a song. Anyway, she stood on stage in front of the crowd, pointing to the crowd with an index finger, you, curling that index finger into a hook for need, then gesturing back to herself and tapping her chest with her index finger. Me. Over and over for the chorus, Becky would point to the audience, then back to herself, like some mesmerizing incantation. You need me. You need me. You need me. That night, in the Hampton Road Auditorium, Miss Becky was indeed crowned Miss Walterboro. Her picture in the paper with her runner-ups wearing a sash, gracefully holding her flowers. And that performance wouldn't just win her the competition, crowning her Miss Walterboro 1985. That song, You Needed Me, would become Becky's own personal anthem, because in time, everybody would need Miss Becky Hill. She made sure of it. Her husband needed her, of course. The two married young. And soon enough, she was needed by her two children, a boy and a girl. Then she was needed by the school district as a middle school teacher. By the mid-2000s, she was needed as a freelance court reporter in the Colleton County Courthouse. And finally, in 2020, the residents of that county showed Becky how much they needed her when they voted for her as Colleton County's new clerk of court. For Becky, this was more than a job. This was her calling. And in March of 2020, Becky Hill was officially sworn in for a term of 4 years. By then, Becky Hill wasn't a teenager in a tiara from the old newspaper photos. Now in her 50s, Becky looked every bit the polished professional. She cut her long brown hair into a short layered bob with cool blonde highlights. She typically wore a tailored pantsuit, playfully adding a piece of statement jewelry like a necklace, along with the gold crucifix she wore at all times. Like many in the Low Country, Becky was religious, and in 2020, Becky Hill swore to God she would uphold the most fundamental principles of the judicial system, as prescribed by the Constitution. Becky also swore she would do her very best to preserve the peace, to be impartial, to be fair, and to treat everyone equally, to the best of her ability. So help her God. Now, the clerk of court is responsible for several key judicial functions at the local level. The unglamorous but essential stuff that kept this whole court system running. Becky Hill, she oversaw docket management, which meant she managed court schedules for the circuit court and family courts. Becky also did record keeping. She maintained the official files for the general sessions, that's criminal cases, common pleas, that's in civil cases, and family court. She was also entrusted with financial duties. Becky Hill was overseeing all of the processing of fees, fines, bail, and court-ordered child support payments. Finally, she was in charge of jury management, which meant she compiled trial rosters and managed the entire jury pool, including the jury pool in the case of Alex Murdaugh. Right away, Becky Hill would find she had her work cut out for her. Just as she began her new job, the pandemic hit, which turned every court in the nation upside down, delaying hearings and trials for months, even years. There was the social distancing, the masks, the no masks, the politics, the drama. And then, just when you thought the South Carolina criminal justice system couldn't get any more chaotic, along came the firing squad. On May 14th, 2021, the governor of South Carolina signed a bill into law. This law was kind of like the bless her heart of the penal system, an attempt to make something pretty terrible not seem so bad. This new law offered death row inmates a new way to die. Before, they just had two options: lethal injection and electric chair. But as of May 2021, they now had a third option. They could choose to die by firing squad. South Carolina wasn't the first, or the only state that brought back the firing squad. But in the state of South Carolina, it had never been used before in formal executions. Supporters of this bill claimed a firing squad was less barbaric and more humane than lethal injection or the electric chair. At the very least, it was more efficient. Due to supply chain issues with drugs used in lethal injections, the default method of execution in South Carolina at that time was the electric chair. South Carolina's electric chair was over 100 years old, introduced in 1912 as an alternative to hanging. But even when the electric chair was considered the top-of-the-line technology in executions, the process of killing someone through the transfer of thousands of volts of electricity, it's not foolproof. Supporters of this bill said that shooting someone in the heart would be less painful and faster than those other options, and therefore, death row inmates deserved a choice. One of the key supporters of this bill was a state senator named Dick Harpootlian. There was a time where he was against the death penalty, but back in the 1990s, when he was a prosecutor in South Carolina, he encountered a serial killer named Donald Pee Wee Gaskins. Pee Wee Gaskins was the definition of the worst of the worst. One of the most prolific and psychopathic serial killers in South Carolina history, with a staggering number of victims, most of them women and children. Criminals like Pee Wee Gaskins, Dick began to believe they deserved to die for their crimes. But the actual process was horrific. And it wasn't just painful for the person experiencing it. It was excruciating to watch. And it was messy. And it didn't always work the first time. Dick, along with his other colleagues, had to acknowledge there had to be a better, faster, and therefore more humane way. The firing squad seemed like the answer. However controversial that law proved to be. For 30 years, Pee Wee Gaskins defined Dick's career. And Dick Harpootlian wrote a book about his experience called Dig Me a Grave. Dick thought he would never have a huge case like that again. But unbelievably, the Alex Murdaugh case happened. And Dick Harpootlian, now a criminal defense attorney, agreed to represent Alex Murdaugh in his double murder trial, soon dubbed the trial of the century. And despite passing a bill that would accelerate the execution process, as Alex's criminal defense, Dick Harpootlian was no doubt relieved when in December of 2022, county prosecutors announced they were not going to seek the death penalty when Alex's case went to trial in January of 2023. Back then, Becky Hill would have been the first to say, "Hey, I only decide what the jury gets for lunch. I don't decide who lives and who dies." But early on, people were confused. Why wasn't Alex Murdaugh being considered for the death penalty? At the time, there were other men on death row found guilty of very similar crimes that Alex Murdaugh was accused of. Why them and not him? This included a man named Brad Sigmund, who was sentenced to death in 2001 after being convicted of killing his ex-girlfriend's parents with a baseball bat. After 2 decades or so on death row, he was scheduled to be executed in March of 2025. And he was the first South Carolina inmate to choose firing squad. What that looked like exactly, people in South Carolina weren't sure. You imagine a man standing in front of a brick wall, a blindfold covering his eyes, being offered a cigarette. But the government-sanctioned version of the firing squad was a little different. And the attempts to make the process humane, they were interesting. In the case of Brad Sigmund, he was led into the execution chamber. He was seated and strapped in a chair. But instead of the chair facing the viewing gallery, this chair would be turned to the side. Those viewing the execution would see Brad Sigmund in profile. About 15 feet in front of Brad was a wall. Behind that wall were 3 volunteer shooters, each one holding the same police-style rifle. They would stay behind that wall, anonymous and unseen. For this execution, Brad Sigmund wore special clothing. There was a black hood placed over his head, and he wore a black jumpsuit with a target, an X, over his heart. So the shooters behind that wall knew exactly where to aim. When it was time, the 3 shooters fired off their weapons, each one aiming for the heart of 67-year-old Brad Sigmund. And that night in March of 2025, Brad Sigmund was the first death row inmate in South Carolina to die by firing squad in the state's history. Back in 2022, when word spread that they were not seeking the death penalty for Alex Murdaugh, it seemed like another instance where he was getting special treatment. But the prosecutors were clear. This was a tricky case. And this was, after all, Alex Murdaugh, a lawyer who would undoubtedly fight the death penalty in a series of lengthy, expensive appeals. It was a risk they weren't willing to take. But in the beginning of 2023, just before the trial was about to start, everybody, including Becky Hill, they were all trying to make sense of what had happened. It was all so complicated, spread across different jurisdictions, different counties, different families, different tragedies. From the death of Mallory Beach in that terrible boating accident, the charges brought against Paul Murdaugh, the the subsequent murders of Paul Murdaugh and his mother Maggie Murdaugh. Then there was the whole apparent engineering of Alex Murdaugh's own suicide, on top of the rampant financial fraud. And there was one thing even more shocking than all of these allegations: the fact that Alex Murdaugh was being charged at all. It was sad to admit, but a fair number of people in the Low Country believed that somehow Alex Murdaugh was going to get his way out of this. No matter what the truth actually was, the charges would be dropped. And if you were in the courtroom, you could literally see why. For decades, a portrait of Alex Murdaugh's grandfather, Rudolph Buster Murdaugh, was right on the wall for everyone to see. Since Becky started working in the courthouse as a freelance court reporter, she no doubt had looked at that portrait thousands of times. Not that Becky Hill needed a reminder of who Buster Murdaugh was. Her whole family knew who old Buster was. Alex's grandfather and Becky's grandfather, they had history. People like to talk about how the Murdaugh legacy spans multiple generations, that it went back over 100 years. But the Murdaughs weren't the only ones. There were other families who'd been in the Low Country for about as long, and Becky's family was one of them. They weren't rich like the Murdaughs. Becky's grandfather was a mechanic. Ordinarily, a high-powered solicitor like Buster Murdaugh and a mechanic like Becky's grandfather, they would travel in different circles. But for a period of time in the 1950s, the two men traveled in the same circle. An illegal moonshine ring of illegal alcohol distribution that was so vast, it was later dubbed the Great Colleton County Whiskey Conspiracy. Buster Murdaugh was its ringleader. Back in the 1940s and 50s, alcohol was legal again. Prohibition was long over. But the federal tax on that alcohol was prohibitively expensive, so these illegal operations were the workaround. That is until a 5-year-long investigation by the federal government broke up this ring. And even before this case went to trial, Buster Murdaugh was accused of jury tampering. One witness claiming that he'd used his influence, be it bribes or threats, to fix the jury. Buster, of course, denied this. But lo and behold, of the 16 people who were on trial, 15 of them were found guilty. And the jury determined one of them was not guilty. Buster Murdaugh. In his corruption, he made no secret about it. Which is why it's surprising that some of the older lawyers who have come out against Becky Hill, claiming that these accusations of jury tampering are unprecedented. Some of these men are the very individuals who say that they knew Buster Murdaugh back when they were young attorneys. And if that's the case, they must know that jury tampering in the Low Country, it's not unprecedented. For a long time, it was just par for the course. This includes Alex Murdaugh, who has described his grandpa Buster as his hero. And Alex, a Gen Xer who was born in 1968, always lamented that he was born in the wrong era, that he wished he was around in the time of his granddad. The good old days. Now, most of these details, they come from Valerie Berlain's book, along with old newspaper clippings I came across. And I didn't see evidence that Becky's grandfather or her uncle went to prison, but they were embroiled in Buster Murdoch's schemes. In a publicly available excerpt from her book, she makes the whole thing sound kind of breezy. Like back in the day, her grandfather and Alex's grandfather, they were once in a bootlegging business together. A case could be made that maybe, given her family's deep ties in the past, from the beginning she should have recused herself from working this trial, just to ensure there was no whiff of impropriety. Then again, this was Colton County. And if people recused themselves every time they had some personal connection to somebody involved in a case, there'd be no one in the courtroom. The jury pool was filled with familiar faces. In fact, one of the prospective jurors was her own daughter, and she wasn't the only one. But of course, Becky knew this wasn't about her. It was about the person on trial. And many people knew who Alex Murdaugh was. They just didn't know him personally. Alex Murdaugh largely grew up in Hampton County. And the purchase of that remote property, Moselle, was relatively recent. And the property was so large. Moselle was the size of 2 Central Parks. It's unlikely anybody in Colton County would have seen the Murdaughs all that much, were it not for the tragic murders of Maggie and Paul. Without a doubt, selecting this jury was going to be a lot harder than choosing Ms. Waterboro 1985. The difference now was Miss Becky was in charge. With its pale, smooth, stone-like facade and unadorned Tuscan columns, the Colleton County Courthouse in Walterboro, South Carolina, was built as a monument to the ideals of the American justice system. No frills, just facts. First erected in 1820, the courthouse was originally designed by Robert Mill, an American-born architect and engineer. This courthouse was one of his earliest projects. Future President Andrew Jackson was a fan and would later tap Robert Mill to bring his Greek Revival style to conceive of some of Washington, D.C.'s most iconic landmarks, including the Washington Monument. That was outside of the courthouse. Inside, it was cramped and uncomfortable. In Valerie Berlain's book, The Devil at His Elbow, the lead prosecutor in Alex Murdaugh's trial took notice of how close the jury box was to the prosecution table, barely an arm's length away, and the prosecution's table was about an arm's length from the defense, which meant they had to be careful. Jurors could catch just about everything: scribbles on a piece of paper, a hushed whisper, the lightest facial twitch. It was all up close and personal. And just behind them, by a matter of feet, was the public gallery, with several rows of long benches, dark wood, polished like church. A narrow aisle down the middle, where spectators could squeeze in knee to knee, 60 people on each side, a total of 120. Throughout December, most of the seats were filled with prospective jurors. As clerk of the court, Becky Hill was tasked with winnowing them down. At the judge's direction, she read from a list of questions. their marital status, occupation. Both sides, the defense and the prosecution, studied each person carefully. Early on, one specific juror stood out. A woman who was what you might call Alex Murdoch's type. She was maybe in her 50s, thin with long brown hair and streaks of gray. She didn't wear much makeup. In fact, everything about her seemed unvarnished. A woman who liked to keep it real. Alex's defense attorney, Dick Harpootlian, he was looking for a middle-aged white woman with a strong personality and a decent sense of humor. Someone that he could see building a rapport with. Someone who might find his client charming, sympathetic, believable. Becky asked this woman what she did for a living. "I work at the monkey farm," she said, dryly. This made everybody laugh. They all knew what the monkey farm was. This woman worked at Alpha Genesis, a facility that bred monkeys to be used in scientific research. There are thousands of monkeys at Alpha Genesis. There are 4 times as many monkeys as there are people in the whole town. "I bet you could tell some stories," Becky joked. And this woman, she was soon added to the jury. Over the coming weeks, months, Becky would get a lot of things wrong. But there was something she got right. This juror, she did have a lot of stories. Only her stories, they'd be about Becky. From January until March of 2023, the Walterboro courthouse was a zoo. In fact, it was a lot like that monkey farm, only it was reporters who outnumbered people by 4 to 1. There was so much hoopla in Walterboro, the mayor noticed that the town hadn't gotten this much attention since the movie Forrest Gump was filmed there all the way back in the 90s. Now in 2023, it was Becky Hill who ran around the courthouse. Like Forrest Gump, she turned up everywhere, rubbing elbows with true crime celebrities like Nancy Grace. Within the first week of the trial, everyone in media knew Ms. Becky. They marveled over her thoughtfulness, her attention to details, how responsive she was to their requests. They appreciated her can-do attitude, her upbeat nature. When her cell phone rang, one reporter noticed the ringtone was Redbone's "Come and Get Your Love." Becky treated everyone as if she was welcoming them to her own home. And eventually, she was there so much, doing so much, she began to think of it as hers, referring to this government space as her courthouse. Becky was in her element because everybody needed her. Alex Murdoch was the defendant, but Becky, she was the star, with a level of status and power she'd never enjoyed before. Especially the power she had over Alex himself. Part of her job was to maintain the integrity of the court, which included making sure all defendants were treated equally. No special privileges. One day, she couldn't help but notice Alex Murdoch in the courtroom, moving his mouth in a weird way, like a cow chewing a cud. What was he doing? Wait a second. She looked closer. Alex was chomping on some type of candy, like a Tic Tac. Defendants weren't allowed to have Tic Tacs. So she let everyone know. Alex Murdoch, no Tic Tacs. It was a small thing, maybe a little petty, But it was nice to have control over someone like Alex Murdaugh, taking things away from him as he'd taken away from others. Then something changed. The demands of the case, the grind of it all, it began to wear Becky down. She did her best to keep up her beauty pageant smile. She tried to be as patient, as nice as she could be. But inside, a storm was brewing. The first rumble happened one day when she checked her email. It was apparently from one of her colleagues, criticizing her or questioning Becky in the way she managed some aspect of this trial. Instead of taking a step back, going for a walk, maybe writing that email that you save in a drafts folder forever, Becky decided to fire off a hot one. And what she wrote was as defensive as it was impulsive. How dare they? Becky fumed. She wasn't exactly angry. She was ferociously hurt and defeated. When she went home that night, she cried her eyes out. As Tommy, her husband, tried to console her, she tried to make him understand. She was 55 years old. Why did she have to answer like a child for things she had to do for her job? Maybe someone with authority had noticed Becky overstepping in an inappropriate way, and they sent an email just to keep her in check, just like someone should have done with Alex Murdaugh years ago, but never did. Becky perceived this person's criticism as trying to keep her down. And well, she'd show them. She'd show them all. Becky would write a book about what it was really like behind the scenes, from the trial of the century. The book would be a bestseller. Becky would be rich and famous. Thanks to the media attention with this trial, she already had the contacts to make it happen. The trial wasn't even over yet when Becky struck a deal with a Savannah-based writer named Neil Gordon, who would co-author her book. The process was going to look something like this. Becky's job was just to take it all in, get every detail. Then she'd spill it all over a series of Zoom calls while Neil wrote down notes and asked her questions. Then at the end of the trial, they'd shape the material into a juicy narrative. The book would be independently published, which meant they were more nimble with their timeline. If they got started soon, they could release this book in a matter of months, long before anyone else in traditional media. It seemed they had it all figured out. Well, except one thing: the ending. Somewhere in the midst of Becky's best-selling fantasies, she fixated on the idea her book would only succeed if and only if Alex Murdaugh was found guilty. Becky even joked about it with her colleagues, how her as-yet-to-be-written book's success hinged on Alex's guilty verdict. Based on the evidence, the witnesses, the story that the prosecution told, how Alex Murdaugh lied about everything, why would he tell the truth about this? At first, Becky didn't want to believe it, but now it seemed obvious. But somewhere in that jury box, someone else heard a different story. It was the defense team's favorite juror, the first juror they picked, Ms. Monkey Farm. And Dick Harpootlian's instincts about her were right. Monkey Farm, whose real name was Myra Crosby, she wasn't entirely buying the prosecution's story. She never said it aloud, because she wasn't allowed to. But throughout the trial, she was suspicious of the entire investigation. First of all, she didn't trust SLED. That's South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. Didn't one of their investigators lie about a piece of evidence? Oh, and the prosecutors, they were rude. and they were rude to some of the defense's witnesses. And she also noticed the experts testifying for the defense. Many of them looked nervous and twitchy. She wondered if they were lying. As for Alex Murdaugh, well, he was full of himself. He was a liar, no question about it. But she kept remembering at the very beginning of the trial, the judge reminding the jury, it wasn't the defense's job to prove he didn't do it. It was the prosecution's job to prove he did. The question for Myra, right up until the very end of the trial, was this. Did the prosecutors prove he did it, beyond a reasonable doubt? She honestly didn't know. Like the season finale of a prestige drama, she didn't want spoilers. She wanted to wait and hear more, like the closing arguments. Then she'd decide. And Myra said as much to that clerk, Becky Hill. When plucky Miss Becky asked her which direction she was leaning towards, guilty or not guilty, Myra didn't think too much about it at the time. She liked Becky well enough. She seemed friendly in the beginning. But as weeks passed, Myra wondered if Becky was a little too friendly, a little too in the mix for a court administrator. She seemed to have something like juror envy, like she didn't want to be left out, and found a way to insinuate herself into their inner circle. Becky was around so much, they jokingly referred to her as the 13th juror. But what did Myra know? She'd never even been a juror before. She worked with monkeys. And at least in the primate world, if you get too friendly with a macaque, they might just bite your nose off. The morning of February 23rd, 2023, Becky Hill was so excited, she burst into the jury room with huge news. Alex Murdaugh was going to take the stand. Today. Did they realize how big of a deal that was? Maybe not, but Becky did. And by then, Becky was so caught up with her book, she didn't seem to view events and people as even real anymore. For her, they were now scenes and characters. A double murder trial as material. Alex Murdaugh taking the stand. That's the kind of drama that writes itself. Becky would deny this later, but jurors recalled Becky warning them about Murdaugh and his testimony. In so many words, she warned them not to believe anything he said. They needed to do more than listen to his words. They had to watch him closely, his body language, for the real truth. When Becky wasn't fraternizing with her jury, she buzzed around her courtroom, doing her job, but also networking for her future book, going the extra distance for her favorite journalists. In one instance, this included Becky sharing crime scene photos, evidence not released to the public. Becky also took photos during the trial herself, though many of those were pictures with media personalities, images she'd include in the book. And it was in late February when they did a jury visit to the crime scene. If anyone had any doubts, one visit to that wretched place, the family's country property, it resolved them. The place felt like it was haunted. And there was something about it. It clicked for Becky. Becky looked around and noticed it was clicking for other people too, including jurors. At one point, Becky remembered locking eyes with a female juror. And in their shared gaze, she knew. They both knew. He was guilty. There were a couple of people on the jury Becky wasn't sure about. Like the defense team's favorite, Myra from the monkey farm. Myra said she wanted to wait until closing arguments to make her final decision, but she wouldn't get the chance. On February 27th, Becky Hill contacted the judge and told him she'd found a concerning post on Facebook. This Facebook post appeared to be written by Myra Crosby's ex-husband, and the post revealed information about the trial, information that could only have come from Myra. Members of the jury were not sequestered for this trial, so the court had to trust the jurors to keep everything to themselves. And it seemed Myra Crosby violated that trust. The judge asked Becky to show him the Facebook post, but Becky said she was sorry, but she didn't have a screenshot. Later, Becky came back with a different Facebook post, though, curiously and suspiciously, it didn't seem to be the same person, and the comments weren't about the trial. Then someone sent an anonymous email. Once again, Myra Crosby was accused of talking about the trial, this time with her tenants. And when Judge Newman called Myra into his chambers to discuss it, Myra denied it. She hadn't said a word. Nonetheless, her tenants were taken into custody and questioned by authorities for several hours. During that interrogation, they admitted they talked about what the jurors ate for lunch: Domino's pizza. The whole thing seemed sketchy. There was obviously more to this story, and it was by no means resolved. But the trial was coming to a close, and Judge Newman wasn't taking any chances. Because of the nature of this trial, a terrible double murder case, the jurors grew close. They formed a special bond. A special bond they expressed in gestures. On Valentine's Day, for instance, all the jurors came to court wearing pink and red. And on the last day of the trial, March 2nd, 2023, one of the jurors brought in a bunch of fresh eggs, straight from his farm. Myra, along with her fellow jurors, decided to stash her eggs somewhere until the day was over. In that morning, at some point, Becky caught up with Myra. Myra claimed Becky asked her one last time, guilty or not guilty. Myra said she didn't know. Then she continued on her way to her final day in court. 10 minutes later, she was gone. Just before the jury was supposed to deliberate, Judge Newman, in the gentlest way possible, told Juror 785 she was now excused. In the moment, Myra was stunned. She didn't know what was happening. But whatever was happening, it all happened on camera. No one saw Myra's face, but they could hear Juror 785's voice. And when the judge asked her if she had anything in the jury room she needed to collect, Myra blurted out, her eggs. And from that day forward, she was treated like a reality show contestant, known all over the world as the egg lady, the egg juror, the one who couldn't keep her mouth shut, and got kicked off the Alex Murdaugh murder show. She was replaced with an alternate. And then, after deliberating just 3 hours, the jury came back. Alex Murdaugh, guilty on all counts. After the trial, Myra just wanted to put it all behind her. But there was no way the internet was going to leave Monkey Farm egg lady juror alone. And the more she thought about it, the angrier she got. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd told the truth. It was Becky Hill who told a lie. And by telling that lie, she'd rigged the verdict. No doubt if Myra were a macaque, she'd tear Becky's face off. Instead, she'd have to settle for a lawsuit. Back at the courthouse, Becky basked in the accolades and attention, the victory of this guilty verdict. She even got a special shout out from the Attorney General, who lovingly called her Becky Boo. And Becky had done such a good job. Well, obviously she deserved a bonus, didn't she? As the clerk of court, Becky was in charge of certain government funds. And so she withdrew $11,800 from that fund. She gave herself a bonus of a few $1,000s, then divvied up the rest of that money as bonuses for her staff. By the summer, everything for Becky was going great. The book was almost finished. She only had to do one last thing. Neil Gordon needed her to write the preface. It really had to be in Becky's words. Becky said, sure, no problem. Only Becky didn't write the preface. Instead, she cut and pasted parts of a story written by a journalist for the BBC. This journalist was filing her story to her editor, who was named Rebecca. And she accidentally typed in Rebecca and sent it to Rebecca Becky Hill by mistake. This journalist asked Becky to please delete the email, and Becky said she did. But instead, she forwarded it from her work computer to her home email. She cut and pasted a fair amount of it from that story into her document, unbeknownst to her co-author. And with that, the book was ready to publish. Becky believed she had a bestseller, never realizing what she'd really published was a damning confession. When the book came out in August of 2023, Alex Murdaugh's defense attorneys, they were all over it, of the possible jury tampering. And they wanted to see what Becky's book had to say. And it was in those pages, it seemed, Becky told on herself, in a almost Buster Murdaugh style. She unabashedly chronicled her thoughts, her opinions, her feelings, and how she expressed many of those thoughts and feelings during the trial. It was as if she didn't even know it was wrong. In December of 2023, it came to Neil Gordon's attention that the preface was plagiarized. And when he confronted Becky about it, she admitted to it and apologized. Neil Gordon decided to pull the book, give whatever money they made off of it to charity, and profoundly apologized to the BBC journalist. While Becky's preface was being discredited as plagiarism, the material found inside the book was used as proof of Becky's misconduct. Along with that, there was an independent investigation looking into the allegations against Becky Hill. And ultimately, Becky Hill was accused of perjury, obstruction of justice, financial misconduct in office, and ethical misconduct in office. It was determined, at least at that time, that Becky's behavior with the jury, it was fleeting and foolish, but they maintained she did not affect the outcome of that case. In December 2025, she pleaded guilty to all of these charges. She could have gotten 5 years in prison, but instead she got probation and community service. She also resigned from office and issued an apology. And it seemed, with the turn of the new year 2026, this whole thing was behind her. But obviously, it wasn't. Murdaugh's lawyers pushed to get this whole thing in front of the South Carolina Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court made the decision. overturning the verdict and demanding a retrial. So this whole thing is starting over from scratch. And how that will work out legally, we can leave that to the legal experts. But it seems the prosecution is putting the death penalty back on the table. Which means if Alex Murdaugh is found guilty once again, well, he'll be condemned to death. But at least he'll have a choice. Bless his heart. Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. This story is so complicated. I've only covered a small part of it. I'll be back in about 10 days with an all-new episode. I'm going to try and do a simpler one next time. Until then, thank you so much for listening, and nighty-night.